Greetings. I'm grateful to have you join with me for the devotion for Tuesday, March the 15th. Before we look at the passage today, I want to remind you to please be praying for Gerald, Melissa, and Eliana Black. We're looking at Proverbs 15. The last devotion I did in Proverbs was Proverbs chapter 10. And I made mention of the fact when I did that as you look at the first 9 chapters of Proverbs, there's this theme that runs consistently through those chapters, and it can be summarized in the word wisdom, how we should seek wisdom, discernment, knowledge, how the fear of the Lord brings all of that about. But as you hit the 10th chapter, it is like then we begin to see branches coming off of that to say, this is what wisdom looks like in everyday life. And if you were to write down every single subject that you could find instruction about, give instructions on relationships and how to be stewards of material possessions and work ethic and comparison, what God will do with the righteous and the wicked, and many, many things. But the theme, I think, for me that stands out, it has always probably stood out in Proverbs. I see it so many places that applies to everyday life in such a practical way is that of the tongue or of speech. I mentioned back in chapter 10, I believe it was approximately 10 verses where the tongue was spoken about. And we get over here today in chapter 15, and there are approximately 8 verses at least that address speech. And if you were to go through and count, you wouldn't find 8 verses that mention speech, tongue, whatever. But let's take verse 18. A wrathful man stirs up strife. Well, he does that through his tongue. So we see the tongue as something that is being indicated here. And I want us to think about something. So much of what we do in life to bless somebody or to harm somebody, we have to make preparations for it. We have to go through, if you want to fix a meal to bless somebody, you've got to buy what you need, you've got to cook it, and you got to take it to them. But our tongue is with us everywhere we go. And how many words we speak a day, who knows? But the Bible teaches us that death and life are in the power of the tongue. And so as we get into 15 here, 3 of the first 4 verses mention the tongue or speech. And he says, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Now just think about that practical wisdom given us there. I mean, is this not true? A soft answer turns away wrath. But if we respond with a harsh answer, then it's like the war breaks out, the conflict. And so the Spirit of God is teaching us, this is how, as my child, you can act and not react. Verse 4. We talked, I believe, in chapter 10 about how the tongue is a tree of life. Here it is a wholesome tongue is a tree of life. Or excuse me, verse 10 about how our tongue can be like a river of life. And here a wholesome tongue is a tree of life. That word wholesome means healing. It is something that brings healing. It brings a cure. It brings restoration. To stop and think that you and I have something within us that we carry everywhere we go. We have the ability to speak healing and hope and life and grace and faith into other people. What an incredible thing that is. But there's the other side of that. We can destroy people with our tongues as well. In Ephesians chapter 4 and 5, it speaks about the tongue. And many times, as people think about spiritual gifts, and it mentions being filled with the Holy Spirit, we just think about the unknown tongue. But listen to chapter 4, verse 29. Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. That's what we're to do. But then he says, and do not grieve the Holy Spirit, whereby you are sealed to the day of redemption. And if you go on and read the following verse, here's what he's saying. With our mouths, we can grieve the Holy Spirit. I think many times the reason we don't see the Spirit of God move in churches is because we as believers are using our speech and we are grieving the Holy Spirit by the way we talk about other believers. And then in chapter 5, verse 18, be not drunk with wine when is excess, but be ye filled with the Spirit. And the evidence here is then that we will speak to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing, making melody in our hearts to the Lord, giving thanks always. So the evidence of a Spirit-filled believer is speaking life, representing Christ well. And in the Proverbs, and in today's proverb, we see this thing of how wisdom is lived out and how we are taught to use our tongue wisely to bring forth life and not death. Hey, let's ask God to take our tongues and make them His vessel, that indeed we can speak life and minister grace and minister hope.